people don't realize or understand that not every one of those occurrences is actually suicide. People think, well, if you take your own life, you're going straight to hell. But not everything is actually a suicide. And the first thing he said was, look it up in Webster's dictionary. And I did, and the word suicide says, willingly, knowingly, intelligently taking your own life. That means you have to be in complete control of your faculties. You're under no pressure, no trauma, mentally, emotionally, or physically. So you're in sound mind, sound body, and sound spirit. Well, most of these things that happen are because people are not in control of their right mind. They're not in control of their emotions. They're under horrific physical pain or stress or duress, and the only thing they want to do is end their suffering. And the Father says what most people are doing are ending their suffering. And we look at it like a sickness that took their life. They themselves didn't want to stop living. They didn't do it so they would not exist anymore. They did it to stop the suffering. And I really seriously had never looked at it that way. That's what a revelation does. It's simple when it's explained by God, but it's something we never saw. But most people themselves know that people who do that are under horrific stress, whether it's mental, emotional, or physical. And the Father said, I'm going to show you what I mean. And then he took me and showed me 3 different people who actually were in heaven living that had ended their suffering. They loved their family members. They loved living on the earth. They got to a point where they could no longer bear the torture, the torment, whether it was a spiritual torment of the enemy, or if it was physical torment from a sickness, a disease, or an accident they had, or if it was mental torment that totally took them out of their right mind. And that's what he did. He showed me these 3 different individuals. One was like a 14-year-old boy. I'm not going to go into the stories. One was like a grown adult man, and the other one was actually a young mother. And they all had horrific things that went on in their life and for years had torment against them, and they got to a point where they could no longer deal with it, and they only were ending their suffering, and they were living in heaven. And this is what the Father says. He says, I'm not about to let the enemy steal from me or take from me what was mine, especially if these were people who had known the Lord. He said, I would be an unjust God if I let something like that, and they had received Christ, and then they had an occurrence or a trauma in their life that put that on me. He said, I look at it like a cancer would take your life. Maybe you didn't cause anything to happen for that cancer. You didn't want to stop living. I know a lot of people who've gone through that. Of course, God delivered some people out of it, but sometimes they end up they just can't handle it anymore. And he said the cancer took their life. They didn't take their life. He said, but when people end their suffering, it is the same exact thing. They didn't want to stop living. They only ended the suffering. And there are many, many people in heaven who did not go to hell when that happened. And so God wanted that to be released into the earth. He says, so many of my kids are believing what other people are telling them, that because they're suffering, the end of their suffering, that they're burning in hell. And this is the worst part about it of all, is when something like that happens, the world will send a condolence. But many times people who call themselves a believer will send a message to the family saying, it's too bad they're burning in hell when you serve God your whole life, which is horrific. We've got to stop beating each other up. I mean, it's really sad that if the world can give a condolence and try to comfort somebody, we at least should be doing the same thing. But trust me, I've seen people that ended their suffering, and God did not call it suicide. He said a suicide bomber, that is suicide, because they're in their right mind. They make that with a clear mind and understanding that when they do this, they will cease living, and they don't care. They do it anyway. So that's true suicide. Even according to the dictionary, that would be a true suicide, that they willingly, knowingly did it, knowing they would no longer exist and that they were taking their own life. But what's happening, actually about 80% of the time, is people are ending their suffering. They're not wanting to die here. Do they come down here and live? No. No one can decide to leave heaven and come down here and live on this earth. He sometimes allows them to appear briefly to people, and I say that briefly. Sometimes they may say something to you and then take back up to heaven, usually right after they die. God does that. I've certainly heard every now and then I'll hear somebody shout something, usually my father, like, you got it. I mean, it's usually a word of encouragement, but I don't have conversations with him. He doesn't come here and visit me. But every now and then, God allows certain things to happen. So I can't say that people never appear down here. I can't say that, you'll never hear anything or smell aromas like your family member's favorite perfume or maybe even their favorite food. I know people that smell brownies and they know their daughter's watching them. So every now and then things can get down. There are things that are sent from heaven,